We will now open up for discussion, questions, and answers. Discussion of any kind.
I want to say thank you so very much about the commentary here on Revelations. My understanding of Revelations chapter 11, verse 1, when it talks about the temple, I was under the impression that it was talking about the temple of God in heaven now. Which you convinced me that it's the church. You convinced me that.
It is the temple of God in heaven now.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. My question for you is, on the 42 months, that number 42 is hard to find in the Bible. You find 40 everywhere in the Bible, 42. And I never saw that overlooked that there in that passage of Scripture. But I have found it somewhere else. And my question to you is, in Matthew chapter 1, and I think it kind of hits on the line of where you're talking about Egypt and the promised land and the wilderness, but there when it goes throughout the genealogy of Jesus Christ, and this talks about the 14 generations. And when you calculate 14 times 3 is 42. Would that have something to do with the 42 months?
I don't know.
Thank you very much.
To me, the Passover, the deliverance from Egypt is a theme that runs through the book of Revelation. And that's why it looks to me like that this fits the picture better than maybe something that's coming out of Matthew 1. I'm not going to say there's no reference there to Matthew 1, but I don't think there is. I don't think so.
Brother Bobby.
Thank you, George. I really appreciate it. To David's question, over in Revelation 13:5, there's a reference to 42 months where the beast is given power to continue. So that's another reference to 42 months. But George, would you comment on Revelation 11 verse 3, the two witnesses in 1260 days?
Okay. Which part do you want me to comment on, the 1,260 days or the two witnesses or both?
Both.
Oh. Okay. Hold on just a minute now. That's one of my, in the back of the little booklet I have suggested questions, right? And that's one, isn't that, oh, here it is, number 8. That's question number 8. What connection exists, if any, between the temple of Revelation 11, 1 and 2 and the two witnesses of 11 verse 3? So that's part of your question. Okay. It sort of looks like there's these two witnesses who just kind of pop up out of abruptly, just with no introduction. Just here, all of a sudden, two witnesses. And I don't think it's quite as abrupt as we might think. I think the two witnesses, if you'll look at chapter 11, verse 2, leave out the court, that's number 1, which is outside the temple. Do not measure it, for it's been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread, number 2, the holy city underfoot for 42 months. There's your two witnesses. The courtyard and the holy city. Two different views of the Lord's church. So the two witnesses are the Lord's church on the earth from two different points of view. And verses 1 and 2 show the church's fate. What's going to happen to the church? That's verses 1 and 2. Verses 3 through 14 teaches the church's mission on the earth. And so you've got the fate of the church and the mission of the church right here in chapter 11. That's what that's all about. Okay, now, I really don't want to get into the two witnesses too much further than that, because I hope that'll be my topic next year. And I don't want to preach that sermon right now. Okay, so now we're talking now about the 1260 days. And that's also, isn't that
7.
question number 7? Why is the time measured in months, 42 months in Revelation 11:2, but the same amount of time is measured in days, 1260 days, in chapter 11 verse 3? Is that the next question? Okay. So, it looks like the 42 months is being used to allude back to this picture that's being painted of the wilderness exodus. And I think the 1260 days, which is also just another 3.5 years, I think that it's put into days to emphasize here's what the church is doing on a daily basis. It is witnessing every single day, all day, every day, for that entire time of the gospel age. And there's also a third time measurement, a time times and half a time. All of them add up to 3.5 years, which is the length of time Jesus performed His ministry. Jesus preached for 3.5 years. That was His entire ministry, and the church's entire ministry is compared to 3.5 years that the Lord ministered. And so the head and the body minister 3.5 years. The 3.5 years are not literal here in Revelation, those 3 different time measurements. So that's my understanding of the 3 different measurements there. The time, times, and half a time, that wording is being used to refer back and link up with Daniel and to show that's what's happening to the church is what Daniel was prophesying about.
Brother Alan Bonifay.
Enjoyed it, George. To David's question, there are only 41 names, even though it says 14, 14, 14. I don't know the solution to that, but there are only 41 names. Number 1, number 4, and number 9, please.
Those are some good questions, Alan. I'm glad you asked those. Number 1, is the church in its glorified state in heaven now, today? In other words, do members of the church die and go directly and immediately into heaven to await the final resurrection of their bodies? And my answer is yes. There is no intermediate place taught in the New Testament. There is an intermediate state, which means a disembodied state. And when we die, we are in a disembodied state, an intermediate state, but we are in heaven with God and Jesus. Now, let me explain why I believe this. I didn't always believe it. I taught, like many of you, that when you die, you go to an intermediate place called Hades, and Hades is divided into 2 compartments. And there's a good part and there's a bad part. I don't believe that anymore. We can talk more about that if you want to, but I'll just stop right there. In Luke chapter 23, verse 43, Jesus said to the thief on the cross, "Assuredly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Today, in paradise. In 2 Corinthians 12, verse 2, Paul said, "I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body or I do not know, or whether out of the body I do not know, God knows, such a one was caught up to the 3rd heaven." That's where God lives. "I know such a man, whether in the body or out of the body I do not know, God knows, how he was caught up to paradise." Paradise is in the 3rd heaven. And Jesus told that thief on the cross, "Today you're going to be with me in paradise." And they went in a disembodied state in the very presence of God in heaven, before His throne. That's where they went. In 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 8, "We are confident, yes, well pleased, rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord." When we die, we're going to be with the Lord. Where's the Lord at? He's in heaven right now. Right now. In Philippians 1:23, I'm hard pressed between the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. I want to be with Christ when I depart, and that's where he's going. Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 7, then the dust shall return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return to God who gave it. No intermediate place, but an intermediate state. Question number 2.
No, 4.
You didn't like number 2? What, if anything, is wrong with the day for a year reckoning of prophetic time statements? Okay, I have 5 problems with it. Number 1, this is used inconsistently. In Genesis chapter 40, verse 12, there is where Joseph prophesied that in 3 days the butler will be killed, the butler will be restored, and the baker will be killed. That's a prophecy, but the days aren't converted into years. Everybody knows 3 days means 3 days there. In Genesis 42, there will be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. Nobody reads that prophecy and thinks 7 years of plenty means, a day for a year. We got to multiply 7 years into days and come up with this astronomical number. Nobody's doing that with that prophecy. 7 years means 7 years. Jesus is going to be in the grave 3 days and 3 nights. Nobody says that means 3 years. Why do we take some prophecies and we turn them into years and others we don't? No consistency in that process. Number 2, this method is illogical. The time times and half a time. What's that? Time times and half a time is 3.5 years. And the old time continuous historical people say, now 3.5 years, that's 1,200. We got to convert that into days. So we convert 3.5 years into 1,260 days. And then, now we're going to convert them back into years. Where are we getting this math from? We're going to turn years into days and then turn it back into years again. Where's that coming from? Number 3, a day for a year is not told to be used in the book of Revelation. Only 2 times in over 1,800 Bible prophecies. Over 1,800 of them, only 2 times were the prophets told a day means a year in this prophecy. It happened in Numbers chapter 14 concerning those spies, 40 days in the land of Canaan, 40 years in the wilderness. It happened in Ezekiel chapter 4 and verse 6. Ezekiel lie on one side for 390 days and lie on your other side for 40 days. And all of that is a day for a year. Those are the only 2 times a day for a year was used, and the way we know that is because God said so. Number 4, the exception cannot be made the rule. There are 1,817 Bible prophecies to be exact. 1,817. 2 of them have a day for a year. I would say that's the exception. And you can't make the exception be the rule. Incidentally, nobody takes the 1,000 years of chapter 20 and says, well, that's a day for a year, so that's 365,000 years.
Hiring Christopher.
He did? Oh my. I take it back. All right, number 5. Numbers in Revelation are used symbolically most of the time. Revelation 1 verse 4, the 7 spirits of God means the one Spirit of God. 7's being used symbolically of perfection and completion. The 144,000 is being used symbolically of an army of God. The mark of the beast, 666, is a symbol of satanic evil. The 1,000 years is symbolic of a great, glorious reign with God. Brother Ron Corder said one time, numbers count in Revelation, but you don't use numbers to count in Revelation. That's right. That's right. And to convert days into years is an effort to try to count with numbers in Revelation. And those are my 5 reasons why I think that's not what's happening in Revelation. Now, number 9. How does measuring the temple fit into the overall storyline of the book of Revelation? Well, in Revelation chapter 10, John sees an angel come down out of heaven with a little book open in his hand. That is the book of Revelation. John is told to take that book and eat it. He does. It was as sweet as honey in his mouth, but it made his stomach become bitter. This is the immediate point of 11 verses 1 and 2. The measured temple in heaven that is blessed and protected is the sweet taste. That's sweet. But the courtyard that is not measured and the city, the holy city that gets trampled, that's the bitter portion that makes his stomach bitter. And so that's how that is fitting in with chapter 10 in the scheme. To get bigger than that is going to take longer, but I'll leave it at that. Were those all the questions there?
Yeah.
Brother Austin Maddox.
Thank you, George. Can I have number 3, please? Question number 3. That's the common. I think nearly all of us here probably heard a sermon on these particular verses, but it's been this particular interpretation of seeing if the church measures up to the law of God. And of course, the church should measure up to the law of God, but would you say that that's not exactly a proper interpretation of this passage, or what's your opinion of that?
Well, the church should measure up to the Scriptures, of course, but that's not what this is teaching. Okay, now here's a couple of things to think about. First of all, to my knowledge, now I may be wrong about this, and I'm ready to be taught. And I want to be taught before I put this in writing and have it published. To my knowledge, the Bible is not compared to a measuring rod. Unless it is here, I don't know of any passage that says that. So, in Revelation 11 verse 1, look at what it says. Then I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and the angel stood saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. All right, now, what was it that he was supposed to measure? He's supposed to measure the temple of God. He was not told to measure a temple to see if it was of God. Does it measure up? Is it of God? He's already told it is of God. It's already of God. Measure it. So the measuring is not to see if this particular church is one of God's churches. It's already said it is of God. So that's why the measuring is not to see whether or not a church is keeping the Scriptures and is faithful or whatever.
Brother Roger Boone, and then Brother Art Lynch.
Thanks, George. I did have a question. The phraseology, glorified church, is fairly common in tonight's topic and in your book. And I kind of had a question. Does that phraseology come from Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 27? If it did or it didn't, you could tell us. And if it did come from Ephesians chapter 5 and 27, maybe you could explain a connection between what you were saying tonight and what's happening, or what's said to happen in Ephesians 5:27.
Well, to be honest with you, Roger, I didn't think of that passage. It does speak about he shall present his church a glorified church without spot and without blemish. And I didn't think of that passage. That's a good passage to think about. I was just using it to indicate the church up in heaven in its final consummated state. That's why I used that. But I appreciate that passage. And do you have some comments to offer on that passage?
No.
Okay.
I just wanted to see how it fit into what's happening tonight.
Well, I'm going to ponder that some more.
Brother Art Bench.
Brother George, appreciate your comments, the study. I had one question. I heard you refer to like Ezekiel 40 verse 3 and some of those passages, and just wanted to get your feedback on, did you see any correlation with Zechariah? Because when I look at Zechariah chapter 1 verse 16 and verse 17, he talks about there the fact that God was going to rebuild Jerusalem, the city. He was going to have it as a city without walls.
Yes.
It would be God's protection. So you've got the blessing and the protection. You've got the destruction, obviously, of Jerusalem that occurred in the Babylonian captivity. And then you go on down to chapter 2, and there's the young man with the measuring line. And he's running to measure the city of Jerusalem. And they stop him in verse 4 and verse 5. It says, my city shall be a city of prosperity.
Right.
And so all of those.
Well, thank you, Brother Art. And that is a passage there in Zechariah chapter 2 that, in my view, strengthens and confirms this idea that measuring means blessings and protection of God. And I would like to read that since it's been brought up in Zechariah 2 verse 1. Then I raised my eyes and looked, and behold, a man with a measuring line in his hand so I said, where are you going? And he said to me, to measure Jerusalem, to see what it is its width and what is its length. And there was an angel who talked with me going out, and another angel coming out to meet him, who said to him, run, speak to this young man, saying, Jerusalem shall be inhabited as towns without walls because of the multitude of men and livestock in it. For I say, the Lord says, will be a wall of fire, for I, says the Lord, will be a wall of fire all around her, and I will be the glory in her midst. And God is saying, I am going to be a wall around my city, and I am going to watch over it, I'm going to bless it and protect it. And that further confirms this biblical usage of measuring, meaning blessings and protection.
And remember, Nehemiah's prophecy was the walls would be built for 80 years. Verse 17, I think also, George, in chapter 1, verse 16 and 17, because he talks about the measuring or the protection that God was going to provide in those verses.
That the heavenly church, the church in heaven, the disembodied spirits. Isn't there one more step for it in the new heavens and new earth? And at that time, before we could enter there, wouldn't there have to be the resurrection of the body? And we no longer have a disembodied spirit? Would that not be the completion of the heavenly church into the final glorified body? Would that be okay?
Yes.
Now, so we can have people, the saints are in, the righteous are in the presence of Christ now, but in a disembodied state.
Yes.
But to complete that state, there has to be the resurrection of the body.
Right.
And so the resurrection of the body is then, when we move with the resurrection, the final, then we move into the new heavens and new earth. Would that not complete that picture?
I think so.
Now, I shouldn't ask this, but I shall. About your intermediate state. Okay. I recognize the paradise and we've talked a little bit about that. Can it be possible to look at the other end of the picture that under the Old Testament, before the death of Jesus, we have the state of paradise, which it contains the faithful of the Old Testament. But until Jesus dies upon the cross and sheds his blood, they cannot enter in to that heavenly city. Until what? Their sins are remitted through the blood of Christ. In that sense, paradise would be moved, if I may say it that way, from there into the presence of Christ with Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. That looks to me like the other end. I'm just kind of asking. Hebrews 11 and 40, they couldn't be made perfect without us. That could not happen until officially or legally or whatever you want to say, it was proved that their sins were not only promised to be forgiven, but they were forgotten. And then they could move into the heavenly sphere.
Well, I hear what you're saying. I believe Old Testament saints were actually forgiven. And I believe when they died, I believe Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob went to heaven to be with God. And that's the first resurrection. And Jesus used that with that argument with the Sadducees, who did not believe in a resurrection, and Jesus appeals to the first resurrection. Those people experienced the first resurrection of Revelation 20, verses 4 through 6. Blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection. Upon him the second death has no power at all. And I believe those saints were forgiven, not based on blood that had already been spilled, but based on the blood of the Lord that would be spilt when he came to the earth and died on the cross.
Well, this gets us into a matter of time and at what time something's fully realized. I realize that. Now, as far as the argument of the Sadducees, the Lord's basic point there was, since he was the God of the living. I wouldn't quibble with that, George. I'm just trying to put together rather this picture at both ends.
Well, I don't believe there ever was an intermediate place.
Yes, I understand that.
Okay.
I understand that. What I'm considering is whether there was, in terms of until Jesus' death on the cross. And it's not something I don't want to distract from good material. Well,
that passage that I read in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, is that right? I can't remember if I'm getting this right.
7 and 9, isn't it?
Is it 7 and 9? 12, verse 7. The dust shall return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. And so there's an Old Testament passage there, I believe, teaching the spirit goes to God. And I believe those Old Testament saints were saved on the same basis that we are, the blood of Christ. But it's like a credit card. You buy your gas now, but the actual payment is not actually made until you get the bill in the mail and you send your money into Visa.
Yeah, I own my house, but I still got the mortgage. And when the mortgage's done, I own the house.
This is an imperfect illustration, but it explains how, in some way, how someone can. Because, for example, when Jesus saw the man with the withered hand in the synagogue on the Sabbath day, He looked at the man with the withered hand and he said, "Son, thy sins be forgiven thee." He hadn't died on the cross yet. Was he forgiven? And my answer is yeah. He was forgiven. But it was based on the blood that would be shed in a few years from now.
Well, we might kind of be saying a little bit of the same
Okay.
thing, sir. I mean, we cannot have the shed blood of Christ is the reality to the angelic host. God's finished his deal.
Yes.
This is shown why in Hebrews 9 he's passed over. But he does what? Now he proves in his passing over he was justified
Yes.
because of the blood of Christ.
Yes.
That's why I was associated. Just trying to complete the picture. I hope I didn't distract from your wonderful material.
So, Luke 16, can you tell us what it is talking about?
So,
I'm not necessarily against what you're saying, I just want to...
So I believe there's a difference between Hades and Gehenna. They both should be translated hell. The old King James is right. It should be hell. Every time you read that word, either one of those words, it should be hell. And the difference between them is Hades is describing hell for disembodied people. So when the rich man died, he lifted up his eyes in Hades, in torments. So he's in hell, but Hades indicates he's in a disembodied state. Gehenna is a re-embodied state. That's why Matthew 10:28 says, "Don't fear those who can kill your body, but they cannot kill your soul. Rather fear him who can kill both body and soul in Gehenna." So Gehenna is a re-embodied state in hell. And Hades is a disembodied state in hell.
And he's looking up to heaven.
He went to hell and Lazarus went to heaven. And Abraham's in heaven.
Brother Doug Edwards and then Brother Glenn Oxford.
This is really interesting for us. Appreciate your study tonight and everything. I want to ask you a question from Peter's sermon in Acts 2. And in verse 34, I'm sure you can see this before, Peter said, "Now David did not ascend into the heavens, but he said to himself, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, I'll make your enemies your footstool." If David is in heaven, and when he died and went to heaven, why would Peter say David did not ascend to the heavens?
He didn't ascend into heaven bodily, with a body. He went as a disembodied spirit. Jesus was the first to ascend into heaven with a body, a re-embodied, resurrected body. And that's the whole point of Peter's sermon. Jesus is resurrected. He's in a body, and he ascended in a body. David never did that. David's still awaiting the resurrection.
Bill, I wondered if he was going to ask my question. But going back up to Acts 2, once again, verse 27, "Because you will not abandon my soul to Hades, nor allow your Holy One to undergo decay." Evidently, Jesus went there. You know, that's what he's saying. He went to Hades and not Gehenna. So to have them mean exactly the same thing would make sense.
Okay, well, that's a good question, and I'm glad that you asked it. Is that 27?
Yes, Acts 2:27, and then also, once again, he quotes it down. Verse 31.
In Acts 2:27, it says, "I will not leave your soul in Hades." Hebrews 10:25 says, "Do not forsake the assembly." That's the same Greek word, egkatalipo, same Greek word. Now there's two ways to forsake the assembly. You can forsake the assembly temporarily, or you can forsake it permanently. Hebrews 10:25 is saying don't do either one. Don't forsake the assembly temporarily because there's danger, and don't forsake it permanently. As a matter of fact, this temporarily probably has a little heavier weight in that passage because he said some people have made a habit out of forsaking the assembly. That'd be a temporary kind of forsaking. So we are not to forsake the assembly, not even temporarily, not even permanently. This passage says, I will not leave your soul in Hades. In other words, I will not forsake your soul to Hades. I will not. It means I won't do it temporarily. I won't do it permanently. You are not going to go to Hades. Period. And there's two things that are not going to happen. His soul will not be abandoned to Hades, not even temporarily. If he goes to Hades even for 3 days, then for 3 days he was abandoned in Hades. And this passage says, I will not do it. And I will not allow your body to see corruption. Two things will not happen. He did not go to Hades. And that's exactly what that's saying. It will not happen.
In my understanding, he's saying he did, but he wasn't abandoned there. You know, he said, because he's making a contrast. He said, David's tomb is still with us.
David's body's still in the grave. It corrupted. But Jesus is being told, I will not abandon your soul in Hades. If he went there for 3 days, then at least for 3 days, he was abandoned. Now, when he died on the cross, he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's the same Greek word. So for half a day, or well, actually for 6 hours on the cross, God forsook Jesus physically. God let him die. God did not interfere. He didn't ease any of the pain. He felt the full brunt of the crucifixion. And for 3 or 6 hours, Jesus was forsaken by God on the cross. If he goes to Hades for 3 days, then for 3 days he was forsaken. And this says, I will not do it. You are not going to Hades, and your body's not going to corrupt either.
So your position is that Jesus didn't go to Hades at all?
Not at all.
Leave should be translated forsaken.
Or abandoned. We cannot abandon the church temporarily, the assembly. We can't abandon it permanently. Jesus will not be abandoned either temporarily or permanently in Hades. Not at all. It will not happen.
Right here, Brother Jordan. I just had a question here about the Hades part and about Luke 16. You know, so I'm trying to understand. So the thief on the cross, when they died that day, you're saying both of them went to heaven. Okay. Well, a problem with that, when you have in Matthew chapter 12, the Pharisees come in and they ask Jesus for a sign. He says, no sign shall be given to you except the prophet Jonah. As he was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth.
That's the grave.
Hold on. And then when Jesus resurrected and he saw Mary, he told Mary, do not cling to me, because I had not yet ascended to my Father. He had never gone to heaven.
That's the question Doug was asking about David. He had not yet ascended to the Father bodily.
Period.
No, bodily. He went to heaven because he told the thief, we're going to go, you'll be with me in paradise. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 says paradise is in the third heaven. Do you know of another place where paradise is at?
Well, I thought it was Abraham's bosom, because it's called Abraham's bosom.
There you go. You're making my argument.
No, but Abraham's bosom is here. So another, when
That's where Abraham's at.
All right, in Revelations, when it says, when Jesus comes back, every eye shall see him, even he who pierced him. When the Lord comes in the second coming, everyone is looking up. Every soul. That goes back to the fifth seal, when you have the souls underneath the altar that are crying out to God. Those are people who have died in their spiritual state, but they're in the middle of the earth in Hades. Samuel, when Saul went to the medium, and he went and he said, hey, I need you to call up, summon Samuel for me. And he asked, what do you see? And she said, I see a man coming up from the earth. And then Samuel comes and says, Saul, why have you disturbed my rest? He didn't come from heaven. She didn't say, I saw a man coming from an old man coming down from heaven. That's not what she said. That's not what she saw. And he came up.
Well, that's a reference to the grave, David.
And he's in the spirit.
He is in a disembodied state right now. Where the thief went, where the Lord went, they're in Abraham's bosom. Abraham is in paradise along with that thief in a disembodied state.
Okay, let's see this microphone. I've got one verse I want you to comment on, please.
Okay.
2 Peter 2 and verse 4. I won't make any comment, just you explain it. Go ahead and get the microphone.
2 Peter 2 verse 4, God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. I think that just simply means God sent the angels to hell.
But that Greek word is Tartarus. You have
Okay.
Hades, Gehenna, and then Tartarus.
Okay.
So
I think Tartarus is another word to add to the two already there. Hell.
I've got thoughts, but I won't share them. Okay, thank you very much. You
Okay.
did a great job.